here we're going to talk about what works for minority businesses in data resiliency, natural disasters, and climate data. Here we have some folks who are very concentrated on the resiliency and data aspects of this work. And so between the three of us, hopefully we can get a good discussion going around how to approach these things, especially these opportunities that are coming up around how do we keep agriculture and how do we keep energy sustainable going into this very uncertain time. So I'll start off by allowing Adrian to introduce himself, then we'll go over to Jim.
Just very quickly, my name is Adrian Gardner. I am a recovering federal executive from government after about 30 years. My last stint was with FEMA. I also have worked with the Weather Service. So this issue of disasters and disaster resilience and how data and MBEs can play a part in that is very important to me. Tossing over to Jim.
Hi, thank you. This is Jim Beddoes. I'm founder and CEO of TDP Data Systems. I've been a Fortune 50 entrepreneur across several different industry verticals. I was last at Xerox PARC, where I was brought in to help them commercialize their research faster. And then I was being asked by Japanese corporations to help them close a growing innovation gap. They could not find startups in Silicon Valley. They said at the back of the VC bus, they got the VC leftovers. They weren't in the VC club. We looked at the ways they were trying to source startups. It became very apparent there was a data issue. So there are data asymmetries. Some people could see the data, some of the data, other people couldn't see any of the data. And there are data silos. So subject matter expert could be ensconced in their own data silo and be totally blind to a data silo that's adjacent. And the third is data inaccessibilities. So whenever you put an entry into a database, it could be a business, it could be a startup, it could be a patent, it could be a research paper. It gets tagged with just a couple keywords. It goes into the database, it's indexed. And if you're not looking for those words, those keywords, then it's hidden to you, it's inaccessible. So we address that to help people make decisions in real time with data. Back to you, Tara.
Thanks, Jim. And lastly, I am Tara Gupta. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Map Collective. And what we are doing is building a global resilience trends interface. So on map-collective.com, you can find a global carbon map where you are able to calculate your own footprint as an individual. As a small business or as a small government, you can calculate your own for free as well. However, we do pair this with extensive mapping of emissions by sector, by source, and by scope 3 focusing in on supply chain. We are able to map out key decarbonization insights, such as if you're making an EV transition, or if you are looking at key natural resources that you might need to take advantage of or map out in order to maintain the sustainability and the ongoing resilience of your business and of the resource that you're using, then those are different items that we are able to map out through this type of mapping technology. Charles, welcome to the conversation. We just started with some intros.
Thanks so much. The link didn't work at first. But anyway, I'm really glad to be here. I'm Charles Sills. I'm Project Director for the Commerce Department, MBDA Federal Procurement Center. And it's my great honor and pleasure to have this amazing panel to talk to you today. Now, as I think most or all of you are aware, the current administration is laser focused on several major issues of importance for the country, for the planet. And these include, of course, solutions to climate changes and challenges, and also helping minority-owned businesses to better equity, justice, and access in government contracting. All of these priorities and foci come together with these three companies. As Tara has mentioned, Tara Gupta is an acknowledged champion, young entrepreneur who has founded this company, Map Collective Incorporated, which, as she described, maps the carbon footprint of any organization, any company. And this is also of great importance for rural communities, for farmers who now can be involved and dedicate part of their work to carbon sequestration in the soil and other adjunct climate mitigation measures. Extremely important for the farming and rural communities. And Jim Meadows, who founded the decision platform, TDP, has greatly aided organizations, government agencies, federal procurement officers in identifying through data identification and management and aggregation, data aggregation. For example, MBEs in a particular region of the country, which are shovel ready to pitch in and bid on contracts in the event of disasters. That's just one of the sectors of data identification and algorithmic aggregation that TDP has demonstrated. This is truly an amazing technology, an amazing solution. So a federal agency can use Jim's platform to, as I said, identify MBEs in a particular sector, in a particular crisis. And then Adrian Gardner, who founded his company, the blockchain company, has developed and provided unique solutions to supply chain weaknesses and failures, and especially in this post-COVID environment and worldwide temporary economic recession, this is of utmost importance. I will give it back to Tara to lead further. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Charles. And so I just wanted to start off with asking the two co-panelists here some questions. And if there are any other questions that come up for you guys, please feel free to shoot them to the group. But I wanted to start off by asking Jim, what do you see as the most important data decisions to make in terms of data insights, and how can your platform support that in terms of resilience and going forward, creating resilience? What kinds of data are going to be essential for that? And how can tools like yours help source that, help support that process?
Thank you, Tara, for the question. We always work backwards from a pain point, and we'll identify a pain point and come up with a data hypothesis. And then based on that data hypothesis, we'll look through the data we've already aggregated. We've aggregated 2 million startups into our database. Startups are pulling in from patents. 75% of patents are licensed by startups. We pulled in 40 million patents from around the world. That comes from research. We pulled in 100 million research papers from around the world. So we have our finger on the pulse of global innovation. Then in addition to that, we pulled in 11 million small and medium-sized enterprises across the US, 2 million nonprofits to team with these small businesses so they have resources so they can better compete. We pulled in all the data from the federal government. So it really comes down to what's the pain point that's being addressed, what are the keywords that are being discussed. We expand the keywords using machine learning that expands the space of opportunities, then to look. And the real issue is no one tends to have a complete solution. When you're looking at the frontier of science, when you're looking at startups, when you're looking at emerging technologies, they tend to be partial solutions. So what we can then do is start combining technologies, organizational capacity, talent together to create a bespoke solution in real time. And then that can go and be implemented. The other thing we can do with this that I think is interesting is we can use data not only to generate solutions, but also provide predictive analytics. So we can look and see probabilistically about events that are on the horizon, both positive and negative. And if it's a negative event, we can then start looking for solutions and start generating solutions to those in real time. So it could be issues around water could be around food accessibility. It could be about anything. We work with any set of keywords with the folks we work with. So that's just some input. Tara, back to you.
It's Jim. Passing a similar question off to Adrian. What is the role of data in how you model out cybersecurity, how you model out resilience in the supply chain, and what kind of data sources do you use?
Yeah, let me change the question a little bit, because I think we need to really speak to, I think one of the things that Jim's mentioned too, which is the pain point. We really need to be thinking about how these MBEs, and I will include historically black colleges and universities, as well as minority serving institutions and MIs, minority institutions, in that discussion. Because at this point, I think coming out of COVID, you look at Russia's war on the Ukraine, you look at, again, sea level rise, the issue of global warming, and how those are directly related to many of these natural disasters, but there are also man-made disasters that know no season, right? That's one of the things my background is about 30 years of federal service. And again, my last stint was at FEMA. And so on the ground in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands for the last year of my career, one of the things that I saw was a catastrophic failure of government, as well as the lifelines that sustain human life, right? And that, you think about that goes all the way back to Katrina. We learned that lesson, early on, that, a portion of a city, a large portion of a city can be completely disrupted. Then we learned during the 2017 hurricane season that an entire Commonwealth or a territory could be disrupted, and disrupted for a long period of time. And then now we're thinking globally around COVID-19, and we look at the different issues that the war on Ukraine has created from a supply chains. So when we look at data and information, I think it's really about, who has access to the information, and then who's in position to actually execute, right? And I'm saying at this point, my hypothesis is that these MBEs, historically black colleges, universities, minority institutions, minority serving institutions, have a growing responsibility to prepare for, respond to, and mitigate and reduce disaster risk across their communities that they serve, right? And many of those challenges result from a long-standing history of not obviously, investing in infrastructure and not investing in sort of the resilience of the communities themselves. But I believe these minority businesses that, I think they contribute about $1.8 trillion to GDP annually, right? And thousands of those minority business enterprises, I think though they're in the position to take the data and information that both you and Jim are creating and now executing. But I think we need to think about that collectively and versus in isolation. So, my goal is through my company, the Chain Block Company, is really be thinking about how do we coalesce that overwhelming group of MBEs and drive them collectively towards community resilience, because the reality is we don't know where the next disaster is going to hit, and we don't know what it looks like. We have data. I think we can do what in NOAA, when I was the NASA CIO, right? One of the things we did was hindcasting, which meant instead of forecasting, look at the track of the storm in the aftermath. How precise was that forecast, right? And so I think we have data and we have information. Now the question is, how do we use that data to actually proactively improve the resilience and sustainability of communities?
The beauty and feasibility of what we've been hearing here is not only data aggregation, data management, but it's the use of data to provide solutions. Maybe each of you could give a great example of how your companies on a project or a contract, how the data manipulation and algorithms, and how you managed all of the factors that you were looking at provided a particular solution to a problem. That would be really terrific for the audience. Tara, do you want to start? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So one way that we are able to, so we map both emissions and supply chains as they pertain to emissions and as they pertain to natural resource flows or supplier relations. So one way that we are helping companies is that we are able to actually map out decarbonization in a very nuanced way. So we can look at distribution locations and then retail locations for a company. And for the distribution locations, if they have a new EV implementation plan that they want to actually map out and understand, how are we actually going to charge these things? How is there enough torque that we can actually implement this? Do these routes make sense? How are we going to make sure that we get everything done efficiently? All the logistics aspects of that can be taken care of through this. So this is on the very large company level, but when you're leveraging the power of this type of software, then the great thing is that you can offer this to much smaller companies as well. You can offer this to small organizations. You can offer this to organizations that can't pay as much. So the benefit of creating a large data system, which is something that I feel like Jim is also doing, Adrian is also doing. The benefit of creating that large data system and taking a lot of inputs is that you can serve MBEs better. You can serve institutions that otherwise don't get access to these resources and this data much better. And so the point of those larger systems is really such that we can have that holistic service base.
Tara, awesome. Thanks. Thank you so much. Jim, do you want to take it from here and tell us about a particular project, contract, and solution that was really important?
Sure. So one project we did was with the Food and Drug Administration, and they were looking for, they could not find doctors and scientists. And we were asked by Korn Ferry to help with their engagement. And basically we could look off across the different data sets we had already pulled in. We had pulled in 350,000 clinical trials, 50,000 medical device trials, 2 million research papers, 40 million patents, and then we could start generating lists of people that would be inclined to want to work for the federal government, for the FDA. And we did that in real time. It addressed a staffing pain point. We've seen the same pain point with the Navy. We were asked to provide a similar type of solution for rapid staffing for data scientists and computer engineers. So one of the feedback we got from contracting agents is that they really appreciate it. One, I talked about expanding keywords, and we had gotten a set of keywords, and we'd done this also with the Department of Energy. They gave us a set of keywords. I think there were 40. We expanded it to 200. Now that's great because it opens up the solution space you can look for, but it also creates billions of more data points to assess. So how are you going to go through this? So we have a library of algorithms, over 100 now. They're proprietary. They address questions like build versus buy, or what's the probability somebody can pass a top secret clearance. And then we use that to assess these billions of data points objectively with a push of a button. And what the contracting officer said was they really liked, they could then work off of this objectively created data list that they could then provide their expertise and subjectivity to. So what we've seen the power is to combine computer intelligence, because computers can address large, vast amounts of data with the push of a button objectively. Humans can't do that, but computers cannot deal with new novel situations. Humans can with intuition and expertise. By combining those, you offset the implicit biases of both, and you compress decision-making time by 80% or more. Back to you, Charles.
80% or more is an incredible achievement and solution across the board on whichever sector you're working in. Thank you so much, Jim. Adrian, could you give us an example or examples of some of the solutions that you provided, some of the implementations? That would be terrific.
Yeah, just very quickly, and again, I won't get statistics. We're really talking more about the cybersecurity and the supply chain risk piece of it, but it's really about looking at a sector. So you could take an example of the aircraft sector. You could take an example of the manufacturing sector. You could even look at the farming sector, and looking at the risk that suppliers bring to a particular sort of operation. So, for example, when I was, I'll give an old example. So when I was at NASA in 2013, one of the things that happened was that the National Defense Authorization Act put out a requirement to actually map and track suppliers into sort of NASA's manufacturing capability. And one of the things that we had, and that not only applied to NASA, it also applied to Commerce and then Department of Defense. That same requirement exists today. And so one of the things that we have to do is look at not only what government agencies and minority businesses perform, but also looking at the suppliers from which they get stuff from, especially from sensitive countries. And so one of the challenges that we have across the board is probably using some of the data exploits that data information that Jim is providing, looking at how those suppliers come together to support specific sectors. If we look across those sectors, we may find that there are actual weaknesses just based on the suppliers that we need to address. And so that's one of the things that my company does is we come in, we map the supply chain, look at the suppliers that are supporting that supply chain, and then we actually come back with recommendations on how we can strengthen or reduce or mitigate those weaknesses across the supply chain.
I think what Adrian just was telling us is an incredibly important example of how his kind of data management can help with critical defense industry related problems and challenges. For example, as many of you I'm sure know, there's been a revolution in the U.S. defense industrial base with regard to making sure that components or chips manufactured, developed by our possible competitors and our definite competitors and possible enemies, such as China, should be kept out of the U.S. weapons platform supply chain. And the only way to do that is by sophisticated computer analysis, because otherwise you can have a fighter plane that the enemy could disable with their IT reach or something like that. It's absolutely crucial that we have a secure, sanitized supply chain for anything related to homeland security, defense systems, battlefield systems, etc. I'll give an example that's not so defense related, how this can affect US-based businesses. Let's take the solar industry, the renewable energy industry, for example. Now, the problem here that has developed and was not the case when the US started its solar industry back in the 80s, but now the great majority of solar photovoltaic panels that produce electricity by absorbing and translating sunlight into electrical energy, the great majority of these panels are being produced in China. However, the US administration, as I mentioned earlier, is set on expanding opportunities for MBEs, expanding opportunities for American-based companies, reshoring our supply chain for US-based producers and manufacturers. So how do we reconcile all these? Let's say, how do we determine in a particular solar panel product which components came from China, which components were manufactured here, how the whole system was integrated here? So this is of crucial importance to the certification of American companies, and especially American small businesses and MBEs, to be able to supply, for example, military bases with solar photovoltaic panels for on-site distributed backup power that assures these military bases, and there are over 50 Army bases in the US, for example, that have now instituted on-site, either solar, wind, geothermal, those kinds of on-site energy producing facilities, but we need to know where the components were produced.
Right. And Charles, you talk about, that's what we call the bill of materials, right? And so many of those aspects of the supply chain and again, the products and services that many of our MBEs are providing, because they are part of that supplier base. So I think we're also issuing a call to action to ensure that any of these MBEs also recognize that that is a looming requirement. And then there's also an opportunity, like you said, to onshore many of those capabilities that are sensitive and that could be provided by US-based MBEs.
And to take this just a little bit further, we just seen how Adrian's technology solution can help determine where these components and parts came from in the supply chain. Jim's TDP platform can find out across the US or for a particular region or state where you have small businesses and MBEs that are in the solar energy business that can provide which parts of a solar facility. So that's another side of identifying US small businesses that can be solved by this kind of data solution. And then thirdly, Tara Gupta's Map Collective company can provide a snapshot of every one of the companies that Jim identifies what is their track record in climate solutions, what is their track record in renewable energy utilization. So it takes all of these different data solutions coming from different sides and different companies together to really get to where we need to go with cutting edge technology and solutions to help MBEs across the country.
Yeah, Charles, and I think the other piece is what, the predictive analytics piece that Jim mentioned, right? Now we can actually build more resilient and secure supply chains, given the data and information we have from all three of these companies and other MBEs that can contribute to that data set.
And that's
Jim,
what I'd
ahead.
like to add, sorry, just on Adrian's point is, we can collectively generate a solution, but what's more important is collect a solution that we can implement it over time. So we can't just hit a switch and make everything perfect.
Absolutely.
But what can we do now in the short term? What can we do in the midterm? What can we do in the long term? And we can build that roadmap because we have our finger on the pulse of global innovation. We can heat map around the world. I mentioned before about the 2 million startups, the 40 million patents, 100 million research papers. And we can use this to bridge forward on how to create these solutions in a way that can be implemented commercially.
Right. And the who, I think, which is Jim, you have the who, which is vitally important, right? Like, I mean, who do we, and again, a lot of these challenges are by sector, right? Aviation sector, so on and so forth, because you look at the different security, risk and the acceptance of that risk. Often they're very different by sector, but doing it as in a sector manner and a holistic, where you look at those MBEs and contributors holistically is vitally important to sort of how we march forward.
Now, what we try to do also, and that's a great point, we also try to look for commonalities across sectors. And so then we can leverage technologies across sectors. So for example, Charles was talking about traceability with photovoltaics and solar panels. Traceability is a big issue with food and agriculture. So then we can, going back to these keywords, we can look at keywords around traceability and seeing what type of technologies, whether it's artificial intelligence, machine learning, sensors, different ways to then provide traceability and embed that across these different sectors.
Yeah.
In order to create the most transparent model and the most holistic model, Jim, you were pointing to the lack of data or the lack of completeness in each individual solution. It's very important that we be collaborative. And Keith has also just asked a question about how can we actually deliver collaborative services and how can each of us be retained. So the point I'd like to touch on here is that in this space, I think it's with these big data projects going on simultaneously, since so much of this field is nascent, it's easy to work in isolation when we have to work with collaborative solutions. And the three of us have been collaborating on different grants and collaborating on the development process and collaborating on ways that we approach companies together. So one, I think we all have different models in terms of the actual services that you can buy, but for each of us, there's a priced system, and it is based on the project that then can lead to collaboration, because we are able to integrate our services with each other. We can integrate data from one platform. For example, I could use the sourcing mechanism of Jim's platform for some of our clients who need to procure feedstocks for biodiesel, or who need to procure minority businesses or a particular type of business. We can use that data, and that's essential to the type of work we're doing. For Adrian, we're in collaboration on a project where we're looking at agriculture, and we're looking at setting up hubs and setting up data hubs in order to empower agricultural farmers or agricultural organizations, or anyone in the food and bev space as well in Alabama. So we're looking at the Tuskegee region and hoping to pursue this under a grant under NSF. So there's multiple ways that we can collaborate, but really the core of it is that we do need to collaborate not only with each other, but with all the data sources out there, with the weather companies, with soil measurement companies like Perennial, who is a new startup as well, and make sure that we can integrate this data and improve this data, because a lot of it is still quite inaccurate.
Yeah, and I think the other thing in answer to Keith's question is, again, bringing in community. I don't want us to forget about the people, right? I mean, the farmers, the people are directly impacted by some of these catastrophic events, as well as that may have the opportunity to, become more self-sufficient if a particular industry will move into their community, right? And so, again, I think that there is an opportunity for us to not only look at a sector from a sector view, but also looking at the way MBEs, HBCUs, and MIs are organized around particular communities that could then result in bringing new industry and more resilience to those locations.
Tara, I know that you've done work on food production, food processing companies, and how their contribution to carbon sequestration and associated challenges can be measured and can be promoted. Can you give us some examples or of that kind of work, and how that helps the farmers that produce, let's say, rice or some other commodity, and how that food is processed and then gotten to market? But I know you've been doing some great work in that field.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So we are looking at different aspects of the food supply chain. One of them being food waste, which is a huge source of unsustainability. So that is something that we are pursuing with a couple different companies, including Meaty, which is an alternative mushroom company, or alternative mushroom steak company, funded by Sweet Green, as well as Phil's Coffee, which is a coffee shop with spots in DC, as well as speckled across the country. And we're also working with Impasta on this, but Impasta we've already mapped, which is a zucchini noodle company. And we've also shown them end to end what their whole supply chain looks like. Where can they focus on production mechanisms, and where can they focus on packaging, and what is happening at each stage? I think this is helping us also identify where in this process are we able to cut down on food waste, on plastic waste, and on emissions that are produced in transportation.
This kind of a capability just didn't exist a few years ago. This opportunity to use data tools to determine the viability, the resiliency, the effectiveness of different farming, different food production, and processing operations, I think is absolutely revolutionary in the rural community and agriculture sectors. And that's, of course, one of our main themes at this summit. Jim, to move over to the defense sector, for example, but mainly how to help MBEs in government and federal and military contracting. I know you've been working on solutions to the Navy, finding shovel-ready companies, and especially companies that can participate in their small business mentoring, or rather federal mentor protege program. So tell us how what you've been developing to help a military service like the Navy reach out and find MBEs and utilize their capabilities, which again is a problem for them up until this time to find those companies.
So thanks for that question, Charles. So Jimmy Smith, who's in charge of the OSD booth for the Navy, you know, his pain point, he said, is I go with the Secretary of the Navy to these events. I see the same small business, same MBEs over and over again. So how can you expand my pipeline? I want to see more. And we had the same question from the Department of Energy for their SBIR program. They said, how can you improve our quality and quantity of our pipeline? And so we're being asked the same questions. And it's basically, we've ingested all this data that we can then use to evaluate and expand the pipeline for their outreach, the federal government outreach. And they're in competition. They're in competition for Executive Order 13985. They're competing amongst the different departments, agencies, sub-agencies to fulfill that. They're also competing with primes. So it's really important to tap into this data to start expanding these pipelines for contracting. Now, we can identify algorithmically and then having humans look at the data, who are the best candidates for these contracts. But what we can also do is look at the ones that didn't reach that top level bar and say, this is kind of where they fell short. And we can team with them with other resources, maybe from nonprofits or other government programs, so they can better compete in the future. Again, it's about expanding that pipeline. And the last point, Charles, I'll make is, one of the issues with data is there's so many different government programs that can be overlapped to support these MBEs, to support these HBCUs, to support community and taking a community holistic perspective to this. So whether it's the National Science Foundation with their Innovation Engine Region competition that's worth close to $1 billion, or the Department of Defense with their UARC program, so University Affiliated Research Centers that are standing up with HBCUs and across universities and communities, there's great opportunity to use the data then to see where these programs overlap and bring them to bear to these stakeholders, these MBEs, these HBCUs. So I think that's great opportunity for everyone involved. Back to you, Charles.
Jim, thanks so much. And some great examples of where some of the funding is and how to access that funding through different agencies right now at this point in time. You brought up HBCUs, and Alabama A&M University, which is our host college and HBCU right now for the summit, is one of the few HBCUs that has succeeded terrifically in identifying and acquiring and performing technology government grants. And this includes NASA. Adrian, with your extensive experience with NASA, can you tell us, for example, how your system can help identify supply chain requirements for NASA that could lead to bringing in additional HBCUs with those capabilities and capacities, or something like that, to show how your data system can help?
Right. And I would look at that question in reverse. I would say, how do we prepare the HBCUs to actually become suppliers for NASA and DoD, right? Because many of them are unaware of the requirements, right? Many of them are not carrying, a facility clearance, so on and so forth, that they would need to actually do some of that work. But that does not mean it's not possible, right? And so one of the things is beginning to have a discussion with them, again, based on the data and information that we have on how they can build, sort of become a resilient supplier to government. But we want them to act as businesses, right? But that means that they're going to have to change some of the culture of the way that those universities operate and actually adhere to some of those requirements. And many of us need to be positioned to sort of support that. So I come from from an understanding of NASA and the way that it operates, right? I ran NASA's mission network for approximately 3.5 years. And so one of the things that we do is sort of, we need to dumb it down for some of those HBCUs because a lot of the bureaucracy is very difficult to sort of wade through. So I think this whole piece of how do we prepare them for that next step? Jim mentioned the UARC opportunity coming out of Air Force Research Lab. So I've been working with that team for probably the last 2 years prior to the announcement of that opportunity. And one of the things that we recognized is that, our HBCUs also need to be prepared to be, equal and viable partners in that discussion, right? And so if you look at them compared to sort of like a Georgia Tech Research Institute or a MIT Lincoln Labs, right? You look at the business infrastructure that's there to support those kinds of operations. Many of our HBCUs don't have that, but collectively they do, and they can, right? And so I am very optimistic that many of these HBCUs, given the opportunity, will perform at that level. But we need to get them ready. It's not going to, as Jim was saying, it's not a sort of a black and white. You flip the switch on, it works. That's going to be a process of them getting to the place where they have the infrastructure and capability to perform at that level. Now, we also recognize that Georgia Tech way back when was at that same level, right? But investments were made in infrastructure around sort of their business process, the way that they interface with the government. And so the same kinds of investments need to be made in our HBCUs.
So well said, Adrian. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we have some time now for questions from the audience. Are there any questions? Melvin Anderson is our IT across the board genius and guru. So Melvin, tell us if there are any questions that we can throw at our wonderful panelists.
Yes, there was one question, and I'm going to expand on that question. If you ran into a 13-year-old kid on the street and they ask you about the most exciting careers in your sector, how would you respond to that kid?
So I can start off. We ran a pilot with the Tuskegee Airmen in Indianapolis, and this was around STEM. And our hypothesis was for most kids, and it was for me particularly, STEM classes as a kid were very abstract and theoretical. And what we said was we can take examples of STEM, these concepts being used by startups in the real world. And so we started generating examples of, well, this is why you need to study advanced math or algebra. Here's a company that has deployed nano satellites in low Earth atmosphere. And this is why it was important. Or this is why you need to study chemistry. Here are astronauts baking in space. Isn't that cool? So it's really giving real world examples of how the applications of these STEM to encourage them, motivate these kids to follow career paths and academic paths for STEM, because like Charles said, it's all about competing with our competitors geopolitically and adversaries. So we need to build up the pipeline, and we can look forward in the global pipeline of technology and say, this is where quantum computing is going to be a real thing in the marketplace. So we need these types of people being coached up for this and follow that path when they're in 4th grade. And we can do that by looking at the data. Back to you, Charles and Melvin.
Yeah,
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, Charles, I would say my excitement is showing up, letting them see people of color that are operating in these fields, and women, from all walks of life, that they can do it also. I think the other piece of it is that it's going to take, a multitude of talent. It's not just going to be college graduates that make it happen, right? I mean, Silicon Valley has proven that you don't necessarily need a college degree. I know that's sacrilegious. And I have 4 of them. You don't necessarily need a college degree to perform in these fields. So this whole notion of, going back to pulling yourself up by your bootstraps that I learned at Tuskegee, where, they also looked at sort of machinists and, and folks that work with their hands as being part of this community. So I think the reality is that we have the ability to be excited about what's in store for their future, as far as there are so many different paths to sort of get in, right? They can do a lot online now that they couldn't do before, to get certifications, to again participate in these fields. So I'm excited and I'm optimistic about, our young people and where they will go and where they will take us, and recognizing that we don't have all the answers and many of them do have the answers and will be part of that solution.
I would actually counter the college degree comment, because I definitely believe in computer science and AI and machine learning. A lot of that self-taught. You probably don't need a degree for that. But in sustainability, I think degrees are becoming increasingly popular in terms of masters of sustainability. Some of the top programs are Columbia, Duke, and you see that sustainability is becoming a very systematic and professional field. And as we go on, it's not like sustainability is a one and done situation. It's not like we decarbonize and then we're done. We have to manage sustainability of our resources on an ongoing basis, and that takes ongoing effort.
Yeah, I'm going to push back on that, being a Tuskegee grad and a student at George Washington Carver, which is the normal school, where, in the immediately or shortly following emancipation, George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington went out and taught Black farmers technologies in agriculture and sustainability way back when, on how they could increase their yields, right? And many of them had no college education. So I'm just going to say that these practices are sort of, applicable both at the collegiate level, but also to the common man or woman.
I think one other path that can be considered is the path of picking up skills and talent by working through nonprofits and civil society. So one of America's strengths is our civil society, and being able to leverage that in terms of propelling us forward with innovation and competition. I think that's another great avenue for us to take, and that ties back into HBCUs, it ties back into the community they serve, and the nonprofits are also part of the puzzle. Back to you, Charles.
Thank you, Jim. We need to wrap up. I think this has been an extraordinary panel. Maybe I'll ask everybody if they have a very short wrap-up statement. Jim, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Charles. I look at what's on our horizon, and it's just amazing the opportunity that's in front of us. As America, as with the technology, the world is our oyster, and there's no reason why we can't solve the pressing pain points that are our doorstep and are emerging. We can address this collectively and with these approaches we've talked about. Back to you, Charles.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Tara?
Yeah, so I just want to say thank you so much for this panel and for this discussion. I really think that there is a daunting problem ahead of us, but there's also a surge of innovation. And you can see that in the collective spirit of all the organizations that are beginning, all the organizations that are collaborating, and this kind of frenzy is really necessary. And so it's kind of a crazy space to be working in, but it's also a hopeful space to be working in because of that.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you, Adrian.
Just very quickly, I believe MBEs and HBCUs and minority institutions are possibly the best position to drive resilience into sort of their businesses, communities, and the infrastructure and the lifelines that people rely on and sustain life in their livelihood. I think lastly, I would say, we look at the opportunity youth out there. I think it's 2.4 million opportunity youth, somebody that is not in school or not working. That is a workforce, that is a daunting workforce that, if leveraged in the right direction, could be the turning point for our country and for the sustainability of life as we know it today.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you to all the panelists. This has been an extraordinary panel. Thanks so much. Great virtual applause for all three of you. And back to you, Keith. Thanks so much.
Thank you.